Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because today's story is one of betrayal, power, and a shocking twist in history you've never heard told this way. The chamber was dark, sealed from the world outside, though its walls dripped with history. It was not in Ouagadougou, nor in Moscow or Washington, but in a private retreat somewhere in the Alps, where shadows gathered to shape destinies. Around a long oak table sat figures who carried the weight of nations. Former American President Donald Trump, with his boastful grin, Vladimir Putin with his eyes like ice, and a small circle of European commissioners. Their topic was not markets or treaties, but a single man, Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier-turned-leader whose defiance threatened the very architecture of global control. They spoke in hushed tones, their words laced with fear disguised as arrogance. Traoré had done what few African leaders dared. He refused Europe's contracts, rejected the IMF's suffocating terms, and demanded reparations for colonial crimes buried under centuries of silence. His speeches were igniting the streets, not just in Burkina Faso, but in Dakar, Lagos, Bamako, and Johannesburg. For the first time, the young in Africa spoke not with despair, but with a dangerous kind of hope. And that hope terrified them. Trump leaned forward, amused, yet irritated. "He thinks he can outplay the board we built," he said, fingers tapping. Putin, stone-faced, only muttered that leaders like Traoré didn't last long. Europe's men of influence were harsher. They wanted sanctions, isolation, sabotage. Cut him off from food. Let his people starve. Then he will crawl. Their voices were calm, but in them lingered centuries of contempt. In Ouagadougou, Traoré walked among his soldiers at dawn. His face, young but hardened, carried the burden of millions. Mothers clutched his hand in the streets, whispering of empty markets and children who went to bed hungry. Farmers bent under debt. Schools with broken roofs echoed with silence. He felt their despair like chains on his chest. The IMF demanded Burkina Faso's gold, claiming repayment for debts carved out during colonial years. Europe mocked him in their press, painting him as reckless. Yet in the whispers of the poor, he was Sankara's heir, the one who might finally tear down the mask of empire. Still, shadows closed in. 3 European commissioners plotted in Brussels, exchanging coded messages with Moscow and Washington. A silent campaign to break him began. Borders tightened. Food convoys were blocked. Generals in Burkina Faso grew restless, some already tempted by promises of wealth from abroad. To the west, drones circled skies, unseen but always watching. In the east, mercenaries moved like ghosts, waiting for orders. Traoré studied an old map of Africa late into the night. The ink of colonial borders bled like scars across the continent. He knew the game: divide, weaken, control. His own aides warned him that standing against the world's giants would mean his downfall. But in his heart, he could not betray the faces he saw each day. Hollow eyes of children, cracked hands of farmers, widows staring at graves dug too early. The conspiracy against him thickened, but so did the fire in his people. They began to whisper in the markets, in mosques, in classrooms, "He will not bend." It was dangerous hope, fragile and combustible, and somewhere deep in Europe, the powerful men who thought Africa's spirit was long broken began to realize they were wrong. What Traoré did next would force the very nations that once enslaved his people to kneel. But on that night, as thunder rolled above the Sahel and storm clouds gathered in the west, the world could not yet imagine the storm he was about to unleash. The streets of Ouagadougou were restless long before dawn. Fires smoldered in tin barrels, casting orange light over faces drawn thin by hunger. The sanctions had begun to bite. Trucks carrying wheat were turned back at the borders, markets stood half empty, and whispers of despair traveled faster than the wind. Yet in the midst of this bleakness, Ibrahim Traoré walked without guards, his boots kicking up red dust. The people reached for him, some crying, some angry, all desperate. They wanted answers, and more than that, they wanted hope. He had been a soldier, not a politician, when fate pulled him to power. The memory of Thomas Sankara haunted him. Every mural painted on the walls, every chant of students carried Sankara's name alongside his own. The young looked to Traoré not just for survival, but for something greater, the promise that Africa would no longer bow. He felt that weight every time he closed his eyes, and he could not shake the fear that he might fail them. In the grand halls of Brussels, the commissioners drafted their plan. Officially, they spoke of stability and economic correction. In secret, they spoke of suffocation. One commissioner, a thin man with steel-rimmed glasses, pushed a folder across the table. Inside were projections: famine within months, riots within weeks. "When his people turn on him," he said coldly, "he will come begging. And when he does, we will extract everything." The others nodded, signing off on a campaign that bore no flag, yet carried the scent of empire. Across the Atlantic, Trump gave interviews mocking Traoré as a kid soldier playing president. In Moscow, Putin's advisors whispered about striking deals with generals inside Burkina Faso, buying their loyalty with oil and weapons. Both men, rivals on the surface, understood the game. Keep Africa fractured, keep its leaders dependent. Never let one man awaken the continent. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, 3 generals gathered in silence, their loyalty uncertain. One dreamed of wealth, another of power, the third of revenge for slights long past. They met in villas behind shuttered windows, exchanging encrypted messages with foreign handlers. Each step Traoré took toward independence tightened the noose around him, but Traoré was not blind. Late at night, in the dim light of a single bulb, he studied a set of documents discovered in an abandoned colonial office. They were brittle with age, yet their words burned like fire. Testimonies of massacres, receipts of stolen gold, reports of secret experiments on African villages, evidence that Europe had buried deep, never meant to see the sun. He realized then that his fight was not only for survival, it was for truth, and truth was more dangerous than any weapon. He shared pieces of this evidence with a small circle of trusted allies, but even within that circle, fear grew. Some urged him to stop, to negotiate, to take the money being quietly offered. One whispered, "You will not live to see the harvest if you continue." He knew they were right about the danger. But he also knew that silence was no longer an option. The sanctions deepened. Mothers boiled leaves to feed their children. Farmers buried their harvest in secret, afraid it would be seized. Young soldiers, barely more than boys, stood watch at empty barracks, their rifles rusting, their stomachs hollow. Yet even in this suffering, a spark flickered. They began to say it aloud in markets, in bus stations, even in hushed prayers. Traoré is different. Traoré will not bow, and in Europe the powerful grew uneasy. Their newspapers printed caricatures of him as a reckless dictator, but beneath the surface, intelligence reports painted another story. A leader gaining loyalty not through fear, but through sacrifice. Every hardship only tightened the people's bond to him. Trump and Putin tightened their grip, but both underestimated the force of desperation turning into defiance. In their palaces and towers, they believed they controlled the game. But in the dust of Ouagadougou, something older and stronger was rising. A spirit they had tried to kill for centuries, now reborn in the figure of a young man in uniform. The trap around him was set. The world waited for him to collapse. But in the silence of the night, as drums echoed from faraway villages and the moon carved silver paths across the land, Ibrahim Traoré began to plan something none of them expected. Something that would not only break the chains tightening around Burkina Faso, but also shake the world to its core. When the final gunshots faded, silence fell heavy over Ouagadougou. It was not the silence of peace, but the stunned quiet of a city that had survived the unthinkable. Smoke curled above shattered buildings, streets were littered with the wreckage of war, and families crept from their hiding places, blinking into the fragile light of a new dawn. The capital still stood. And with it, so did hope. For days, the smell of burned earth and blood lingered in the air. Volunteers worked tirelessly to clear rubble, to dig survivors from beneath collapsed walls, to bury the fallen with honor. Soldiers who had fought through the night stood side by side with civilians, their uniforms stained with the same dust, their faces marked by the same exhaustion. Mothers cooked for entire battalions, strangers embraced like kin, and prayers rose from every corner of the city. Traoré walked among them, not hidden behind armored cars or distant balconies, but on foot, his boots sinking into the same ash as his people. He carried no speeches written on paper. His presence was the message. In his eyes, the nation saw not a ruler, but a man who had chosen to stand, bleed, and fight with them. And word spread. Within days, villages across Burkina Faso lit fires in celebration. From the northern Sahel to the southern farmlands, communities that had once trembled under the shadow of terrorism raised their voices in defiance. Songs were sung, drums beaten, and the names of the fallen turned into hymns. Children who had lived their short lives in fear now shouted freely in the streets. The darkness had not disappeared, but it had been pierced. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the world reacted with disbelief. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin was briefed on the battle's outcome. His advisors spoke carefully, avoiding the word failure, but the humiliation was plain. His mercenaries had lingered, waiting for collapse, yet collapse never came. Instead, the terrorists, forces Moscow quietly hoped would pressure Traoré, were shattered. Putin clenched his jaw as he realized that his attempt to test Burkina Faso's resolve had backfired. In the eyes of Africa, Russia's silence in Burkina Faso's darkest hour was proof of indifference, not friendship. Across the Atlantic, Donald Trump's private contractors seethed. They had promised quick salvation, whispered offers of guns, helicopters, and specialists in exchange for lucrative contracts and influence. But Traoré had rejected them. He had chosen resistance over dependency, and now, in the aftermath, Trump's men looked not like saviors, but like opportunists left empty-handed. Washington and Paris watched with their own quiet alarm. A dangerous precedent had been set. For decades, Africa had been painted as dependent on aid, on foreign militaries, on outside stability. But Burkina Faso had rewritten the story. A small nation, cornered and bleeding, had stood without leaning on superpowers, and survived. This was more than a battle. It was a declaration. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Conakry, leaders whispered that if Burkina Faso could defy the odds, perhaps they could too. Youth across the Sahel painted murals of Traoré with fire in his eyes, a red beret tilted defiantly, his silhouette rising like a shield against the storm. Hashtags flooded social media, carrying messages of African unity and self-reliance. Burkina Faso, once spoken of in pity, was now spoken of in reverence. But even victory came with scars. The capital had bled. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. Thousands were displaced. Graves stretched across the countryside. The cost of defiance was etched into every broken wall, every empty chair at the dinner table. Traoré knew this. And in the quiet after the battle, when the cheering had softened into mourning, he stood before his people and spoke not of triumph but of responsibility. "We have defended our land," he said, his voice echoing through the capital square. "But victory is not survival alone. We must rebuild not just our homes but our spirit. Terror has been driven back, but its shadow lingers. Let us prove that Burkina Faso does not simply endure. Burkina Faso creates. Burkina Faso rises." The crowd erupted, not with wild celebration, but with steady, grounded resolve. It was the sound of a people not blinded by victory, but strengthened by it. International media scrambled to explain what had happened. Headlines called it the miracle of Ouagadougou, the day Africa defied terror, the stand that changed the Sahel. Analysts debated how a nation with limited resources could repel such a coordinated assault. They overlooked one truth. Weapons can be bought, strategies can be borrowed, but unity cannot be imposed from outside. Burkina Faso's strength had come from within, yet for every headline, there was also fear. Western think tanks warned that Traoré was growing too powerful, too inspiring. The idea of an Africa that looked inward rather than outward was dangerous to those who had long profited from dependency. The whispers of sanctions grew louder. Political analysts predicted instability, but the people of Burkina Faso had stopped listening to predictions. They had written their own. Weeks later, in a modest ceremony beneath the open sky, the fallen were honored. Thousands gathered, each face lit by flickering torches. Names were read, one by one, echoing into the night. Children released lanterns into the sky, their lights rising like souls toward the heavens. And as the last name faded into silence, The crowd raised a single unified chant. Burkina Faso lives! It carried across the plains, over the rivers, into the ears of allies and enemies alike. And somewhere in the shadows of the desert, the remnants of the terrorist alliance, the Viper's men, the Jackal's raiders, the Phantom's ghosts, trembled. They had thrown everything at the capital and failed. Their myth of invincibility had cracked. Recruitment slowed. Fear shifted. The hunters had become the hunted. For Traoré, the battle was not the end, but the beginning. He knew the terrorists would regroup, that foreign powers would sharpen their knives, that the scars of war would not heal overnight. But he also knew something greater had been born: belief. A people who once looked outward for salvation had discovered their own strength, and that was a weapon no enemy could disarm. The story of Burkina Faso's stand traveled far beyond its borders. In dusty villages across Africa, young boys wore red berets with pride. In cities from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, murals bloomed across walls, painted with the words, "Africa is not weak. Africa is rising." And in the quiet chambers of power where leaders schemed and empires plotted, one unsettling truth echoed like a warning bell. If Burkina Faso could do this alone, what would happen if Africa stood together? The world did not return to silence after Burkina Faso's stand. The echoes of that night, the gunfire, the courage, the unyielding resistance, continued to reverberate across continents, carried not just by news broadcasts, but by whispers in markets, classrooms and hidden gatherings, in Africa's villages, where stories were still told by firelight. Elders spoke of Traoré's defiance as if it were myth, placing him beside Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah. Children who once grew up fearing the sound of gunfire now grew up dreaming of courage. They no longer asked, "Who will save us?" but "What can we become?" And that shift was the true victory. Terrorism, though bloodied, was not gone. Shadows still lingered in deserts and forests, knives still glinted in the night. But the myth of invincibility, the idea that the people of Burkina Faso would always bow, was gone forever. Terrorism could no longer claim inevitability, and that made it mortal. The foreign powers, too, felt the shift. In Washington, think tanks scrambled to redefine Africa. In Moscow, silence became strategy. In Paris, anger simmered, as officials quietly admitted that their grip on the Sahel was weakening. But none could undo the image now carved into history. A small, battered nation refusing to break, led not by a puppet of global powers, but by a man who chose unity over submission. What frightened them most was not Traoré's victory, but what it symbolized. For decades, the world had thrived on a simple equation: Africa divided, Africa dependent, Africa desperate. But Burkina Faso had disrupted the pattern. If one nation could break the cycle, others might follow. Already murmurs spread. In Mali, youth movements rose, chanting for sovereignty. In Guinea, workers marched with flags painted in defiant colors. In Niger, whispers of rebellion turned into songs of resistance. Across the continent, a generation stirred, no longer satisfied with borrowed solutions and broken promises. For Traoré, the weight of victory was heavy. He walked not as a man unscathed, but as one marked by loss. His people looked to him not only as a leader, but as a symbol, and symbols carry burdens greater than crowns. In the nights after the battle, he sat alone in his office, candlelight flickering across maps stained with notes and scars. He knew the terrorists would return, and he knew the superpowers would not forgive. Yet he also knew that something deeper had been born. The Geneva Summit Hall emptied like a breached dam. Leaders who moments before had sat in smug certainty now fled into backrooms, hunted by cameras, pressed by reporters shouting questions they had no answers for. The documents Traoré laid bare spread across the world in minutes, their images carried on live streams, news broadcasts, and endless social feeds. No denial could erase what people had seen with their own eyes: massacres ordered, gold stolen, children broken by experiments. The weight of centuries of silence had been shattered, and with it, the illusion of innocence Europe had worn for so long. In Ouagadougou, the news reached the streets within hours. Crowds gathered around battery-powered radios, around flickering televisions powered by generators. They wept at the names read aloud, the lost villages finally spoken into history. They cheered at the sight of Traoré standing alone before the world's powers, refusing to bend, refusing to apologize for telling the truth. The hungry did not suddenly eat, the weary did not suddenly rest, but in their eyes a fire returned. They were not victims in silence anymore. They were witnesses, and witnesses carried power. Across Africa, the reaction was electric. In Dakar, tens of thousands filled the streets, chanting Traoré's name alongside Sankara's. In Johannesburg, students stormed campuses with banners demanding reparations. In Kinshasa, old men wept as they watched proof of the colonial crimes they had lived through, finally acknowledged before the eyes of the world. Even in Cairo, Lagos, and Nairobi, where governments were hesitant to endorse his defiance, the people made their own choice. They marched, they shouted, they declared that Africa would no longer bow. Europe scrambled to contain the storm. Press conferences were called in Brussels, London, and Paris, each one more frantic than the last. Politicians tried to paint the documents as misinterpreted, outdated, exaggerated. But the signatures were there, the photographs undeniable, the bloodstains permanent. Pressure mounted not just from Africa, but from within. Protesters filled European streets, young and old, demanding truth, accountability, and apology. "Not in our name," they shouted, turning the shame back on their leaders. Trump retreated into bluster, declaring Traoré a liar and the summit a circus. Yet behind the bravado, even his closest allies whispered that he had been exposed. Putin, furious at being implicated in secret deals, denounced the revelations as Western fabrications. But his face in Geneva had been caught on camera, the crack in his mask immortalized. Their denials rang hollow. In Brussels, after weeks of riots, petitions, and parliamentary revolts, Europe broke. On a cold morning, the European Commission convened a public session, broadcast live across continents. With heavy words and eyes downcast, they acknowledged the undeniable. They admitted the truth of the crimes, centuries of plunder, centuries of chains. And then, the moment no one thought they would ever see, they apologized to Africa, formally, unconditionally, on record. The hall where the apology was made shook with chants outside. It was not enough to heal the wounds, not enough to return the stolen years, but it was the beginning of something new. A crack in the armor of empire. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré returned to his people not as a broken man, but as a symbol reborn. He stood in the same dusty streets where mothers had begged him for food, where children had fainted from hunger. Now they lifted him on their shoulders, their chants echoing across the capital. The hunger was not gone, the sanctions not yet lifted, but their spirit had transformed. They were no longer begging to survive. They were demanding to live free. Traoré addressed them under the open sky. His voice carried across the crowd, steady and strong. He told them that justice had only begun, that apology was not the end, but the first stone in rebuilding dignity. He told them their suffering had been seen, their silence broken, their chains cracked. And then he asked the question that would travel far beyond Burkina Faso, far beyond Africa itself. Is this the day Africa broke its chains? The people roared back, not with words, but with a sound that shook the ground, a sound that echoed across deserts and jungles, cities and villages. A sound of a continent rising, and in that roar, the world understood. Ibrahim Traoré had not only shaken Europe, he had shaken the world.